It's a real pleasure to be here to talk on the subject of making globalization work for developing countries. In a way, the title summarizes a great deal of what I'm going to say. Making globalization work suggests that it's not working. And in fact, that's one of the themes, that it's not working both for developed and developing countries. But the title, Making Globalization Work, also suggests a note of optimism that there are reforms in the way globalization is managed that could make it work. So what I want to do this afternoon is to describe both some of the successes of globalization for developing countries, some of the failures, and some of the reforms in the way globalization is managed that could enhance the likelihood of success. When one talks about the successes of globalization, one has to begin with the story of India and China, two countries with 2.4 billion people, which have been growing at historically unprecedented rates, continuing the successes of the East Asian miracle, which Japan had led beginning in the early 1960s. The pace of this growth is really phenomenal. China has been growing at close to 10% for 3 decades. Little noticed is that India has been growing at 5 to 6% for a quarter century, and in the last few years has been growing at actually 8% or more. And in fact, these countries have become the engine of global economic growth. World economy has been growing at close to 5% for the last 2 or 3 years, rate not seen for several decades, a quarter century. And it's not on the basis of growth in Japan, in the United States, or Europe. It's the basis of this has been growth in these emerging markets. I just want to spend a moment putting all this in historical perspective, because sometimes we forget how fast the world can change. In 1820, 175 years ago, China had a third of global GDP, and India had more than 15%. And this is a picture of what global GDP looked like over the centuries. These numbers are not very, very reliable, but they're not too bad. And what they show is, as I say, that China had close to a third of global GDP, and India 15% in 1820. And what you see is the rapid decline in India and China beginning in 1820. And now they're getting back, but only partially back. It wasn't an accident that they declined. It was actually a result of changes in technology and economic policies. The Industrial Revolution and deliberate attempts on the part of the UK government and other governments to kill India, to kill Indians' exports, and it worked. Indian textile exports to Britain fell by 2/3 in the span of a decade. India had been a major global producer of textiles. It became a major importer of textiles from the UK. So it shows that policy can make a difference. But it wasn't just soft policy, it was also military policy. And the European powers attacked China because they wanted to make sure that China was open to opium. China was exporting ceramics and other goods that Europe wanted, but Europe had nothing that China wanted. So Europe figured if they could get China addicted to opium, they would have something to sell. It's a sad moment in global history. Globalization has played a major role in the successes of China, India, largely by both the export-led growth and access to technology. As I say, globalization, and here I'm just focusing on economic globalization, the closer integration of the countries of the world as a result of lower communication and transportation costs, and the reduction of man-made barriers to movements of goods, services, capital, people, ideas, and knowledge. And the pace of the lowering of telecommunication costs in the 90s is really a phenomenal 50% annual compounded annual decline. These are the successes of globalization, and as I turn to talk about some of the problems, one shouldn't forget the importance of these successes. But elsewhere, there is a great deal of discontent with globalization, both as a result of the outcomes of globalization and the processes. And I want to talk about both. There's a marked contrast between the success in East Asia and the disappointments elsewhere. For instance, Latin America, which was the best student of the Washington Consensus, the set of policies that the World Bank and the IMF pushed on the world, in the decade of the 90s, where this advice was most assiduously followed, their growth was half of what it was in earlier decades. Brazil grew at 5.7% for 75 years before 1980. And then they started listening to the World Bank and the IMF, and now they're happy if they grow at 2 or 3%. That's viewed as a success. They forgot the fact that for 75 years they grew at close to 6%. The region as a whole has been marked by growing poverty, unemployment, crime, a growing fraction of the population in the informal sector without job protections. And what growth has occurred has gone mainly to the upper income groups. Looking at it over a 25-year period, Africa has had a decline in per capita income. The good news is the last 2 or 3 years this has been arrested. And one shouldn't again forget that, and hopefully maybe we'll have time later to talk about what is the reason for this change, this growth in Africa in the last 2 or 3 years, and can it be sustained? An American, Tom Friedman, has written a very popular book called The World is Flat. What I wanted to emphasize is the world is not flat. He has argued that as a result of the new technologies, the world is on a level playing field. The developing countries can compete on an even keel with the advanced industrial countries. And obviously, what he's focusing on is the fact that the global geography has changed. China and India are more competitive, but Africa is in some ways less competitive. It has neither the resources nor the education to take advantage of the new technologies. Not only is the world not flat, but in many ways it's becoming less flat. There's growing inequality between the countries, and there's growing inequality in most countries around the world. And globalization has played an important role in these failures. And in fact, the growing inequality in the advanced industrial countries is something that was predicted by economic theory more than 50 years ago. And the way to see that is to think of a thought experiment. This is something that's not advertised by the advocates of globalization, and it's not talked about, but just think about the following thought experiment. What would happen if there were perfect integration of the countries of the world? Markets were perfect. We're nowhere near that, so don't worry. But if that happened perfectly, what would the world look like? Well, it would mean that unskilled workers would get the same pay everywhere in the world. That's what we mean by full global integration. And that would mean that unskilled wages in Japan, the United States, the UK, would be the same as unskilled wages in China, India. And that means they would be much lower than they are today. And while we're nowhere near that, one of the results of my teacher, Paul Samuelson, was to show that even without perfect globalization, just trade liberalization moves you in this direction and is a force for lowering of wages of unskilled labor and increasing inequality. Unfair trade treaties have compounded the problems in the developing countries, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But these problems are compounded by asymmetric liberalization. We've worked more for liberalizing capital, the flows of capital, than we have for labor, liberalizing more of the flows of capital-intensive goods than of labor-intensive goods. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the bargaining power of capital is increased relative to labor, because if taxes are increased or if wages are too high, capital will say, we'll go somewhere else where we're treated better. But workers can't do that. Particularly unskilled workers can't move. So you've changed the bargaining power, and the result of that change in the bargaining power is a lowering of unskilled wages to the disadvantage of capital. And you see this pattern around the world. As I mentioned before, one of the ways that globalization has played a role in the failures is that it's given a set of advice which has not been good for development. Latin America followed the advice of the IMF and the World Bank. It was Argentina, for instance, was the A+ student. And after the crisis in Argentina, other countries in Latin America would say, if this is what happens to the A+ student, we don't want to go to that school. The remarkable thing is that Argentina, after it got rid of the IMF, after it went into default, has been growing at 8% for more than 4 years. So now, not only did it catch up to where it was before, but it's actually exceeded its income in the pre-crisis level. The contrast between the transition countries following the Washington Consensus policies and China and Vietnam, which did not, is marked. And finally, one has to note that Africa has continued to be exploited even in the post-colonial world. Advanced industrial countries have been willing to take out the resources from this country, from Africa, but have not really contributed to strengthening education, technology, and the other things that lead to long-term economic growth. Well, let me try to describe now some of the more particular problems in the global architecture, economic architecture. One of the sets of problems is in finance. One would have thought that globalization, more advanced markets, more sophisticated market economies would lead to more stability, but in fact, it's led to more instability. There's been 100 crises in the last 30 years. It's more unusual for a country not to have a crisis than have a crisis. East Asia, of course, is the most famous crisis, and but as I say, it was only one of many crises that have marked the last 3 decades. But equally disturbing is the fact that money is flowing from poor countries to rich countries. Last year, about $500 billion went from developing countries to the advanced industrial countries. That's not the way money is supposed to go. It's supposed to go from rich to poor. It's going the wrong way. Well, money is going from the rich to the poor, from the poor to the rich. Again, economic theory says the rich countries ought to be better able to absorb risk. But in spite of the advances in the ability to slice and dice risk, the poor countries still bear the brunt of risk. They tend to borrow in short-term, hard currencies, and that means when exchange rate changes or interest rates soar, they're left bearing the burden. And that is one of the reasons why there have been so many crises around the world. The advanced industrial countries have done a great deal to protect their own interests. There's been a rash of what are called bilateral investment agreements, or investment agreements that are part of bilateral trade agreements. And they've tried to protect investor interest, but little has been done to protect the interests of the developing countries, for instance, to protect their environment. And unfortunately, all too often, multinationals use the limited liability to protect themselves after taking out the natural resources. In the area of trade, I mentioned before that international trade regime is unfair to developing countries, but the magnitude of this is sometimes unappreciated. If you look at the agenda of the Uruguay round, which was the last round of trade agreements that was signed in 1994, it focused completely on the agenda of the advanced industrial countries. One of the major advances of the Uruguay round is that it went into services. Well, normally you would think services are labor intensive, developing countries are labor rich. Shouldn't that be pro-development? But when they said services, they didn't mean services. What they meant is the services that the advanced industrial countries export. Services like IT services and financial services. They didn't mean maritime services or construction services, the services that are unskilled labor intensive and are the comparative advantage of the developing countries. So if you look at the agenda, it was framed around the interest of the developing countries, of the developed countries. There were actually 4 issues that were talked about at the beginning of the Uruguay round. The developing countries wanted something done about agricultural subsidies and about textiles, and the developed countries wanted intellectual property rights, which should never have been in the agreement, and financial services. The developed countries got what they wanted, but the developing countries did not get any reduction in agricultural subsidies. And in the case of textiles, they were told to wait for 10 years. And then after waiting for 10 years, they were told to wait a little bit longer. Well, the result of this is that most of the gains went to developed countries. But that wasn't so surprising. What was so disturbing is that the poorest countries of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, were actually made worse off. The magnitude of the imbalance, of the way the system is stacked against the poor countries, is highlighted by the fact that the OECD, the advanced industrial country, tariffs on goods from poor countries are 4 times higher than they are on the goods from other OECD countries. So in fact, if you look at the exports from a small country like Mongolia, it may actually be larger. The tariffs they have to pay are larger than the tariffs paid by a country like France. The whole tariff structure is designed to discriminate against developing countries and actually to inhibit developed countries. The rich countries cost poor countries 3 times more in trade restrictions than their total development assistance. So this just gives you a magnitude of the unfairness of the trade issues. The agricultural subsidies are roughly equal to what the farmers produce themselves. So I sometimes jokingly say that American corn farmers are more accurately described as farming Washington than farming the soil, because they get as much money from Washington than they do from the land. It was because the Uruguay round was so unfair that there was a need for the development round to address these problems. But what turned out was not a development round. It was really an attempt by the advanced industrial countries to put old wine in new bottles. And some of the elements of what was called the development round were even anti-development. The problem is not only did they just put old wine in new bottles, but the US and the EU actually reneged on their promises. And the result of this is, I would argue, that the development round does not even deserve to be called a development round. It is not surprising, as a result, that the developing countries are rejecting the development round. India and Brazil have basically said, we won't go along with the agreement. The fact is there's a lot of toing and froing now. Who's to blame for the breakdown? In my mind, it's clearly the advanced industrial countries, the US and the EU. Some people have said, and to put that to highlight what that means, the U.S. has offered to cut its agricultural subsidies by raising them by 50%. It says, okay, our offer to you is that we won't raise them by more than 50%. But you have to understand they're raising them 50% by 100%. Before that, they raised them by 100% from what they were at the Uruguay round when they were supposed to reduce them. So first they double them, and then we say, okay, we're going to make you an offer. The offer is that we won't raise them by another 50%, more than another 50%. And it's not surprising that developing countries find this a little bit dishonest or disingenuous. Well, who's going to be hurt? Well, the fact is that if you look at where the development round has evolved, the benefits to developing countries currently are so small that they have very little benefit out of it, even if it's completed. Another problem with globalization as it's managed today has to do with knowledge. Knowledge is an important aspect of globalization. I mentioned before that one of the bases of success of East Asia was that it was able to take knowledge from around the world and grow on the basis of it. One of the lessons of modern development is that what separates developing countries from developed is not just a gap in resources, but a gap in knowledge. And so closing the knowledge gap is a central part of a development strategy. But an unbalanced intellectual property regime makes it more difficult to close that, and TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property provisions of the Uruguay round, were unbalanced. They have reduced access to knowledge. But even worse, they make it more difficult to get access to life-saving medicines. As a result of the last round, thousands of people will be dying. Not surprisingly, the developing countries have called for a development-oriented intellectual property regime. Another set of problems has to do with global warming, global climate. This is, again, a global problem because global warming is the quintessential global problem. We all share one atmosphere. But it's another arena in which global social injustices are being played out. The major source of pollution have been the advanced industrial countries. The major reason that the level of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases today in the atmosphere are much higher than they were in the pre-industrial age are the burning of the fossil fuels in the advanced industrial countries. But some of the major consequences lie in the South. Finally, one of the reasons that there is such discontent with globalization is that other values have been dominated by economics. The environment is sacrificed for short-term commercial interest. There's reduced access to life-saving medicines. While no compensation is provided to developing countries for their environmental services, either in biodiversity or carbon sequestration, no protection of traditional knowledge from developing countries, a concept called biopiracy. Worry about the fact that traditional cultures are weakened, restrictions on the ability to subsidize culture, and finally, democratic processes are undermined, for instance, by IMF conditionality. What I've tried to describe so far is the many ways in which the reasons for the discontent with globalization in terms of the outcomes. But there's also concern about the processes by which decisions get made. The concern is that global governance has been undemocratic, In particular, the voice of developing countries has not been heard, and even when it's heard, it is not listened to. It's often dominated by the North, or more accurately, by special interests in the North, where the rules are made by the advanced nations for the advanced nations, or more accurately, for the special interests within them. We recently have seen the nature of the problems highlighted by what's happened in the World Bank. Here we have an institution committed to supposedly a multilateral institution committed to promoting development, but the head of it is appointed by the United States. And they appointed somebody whose major credential was that he was the architect of the war in Iraq. What you would not have thought was a strong credential for being the head of the world's major poverty-fighting institution. And after he became the head, the agenda that he put for the World Bank was not an agenda that was focused on reducing poverty. It was corruption. He talked about corruption. Corruption is important, but the way he did it was actually corrupt. He picked out the countries that were pro-United States and said, we'll ignore corruption there until they annoy the United States. So the most famous case of that, Uzbekistan got a lot of aid until Uzbekistan told the United States, we want you to leave your Air Force bases. And then the next day he discovered there was corruption in Uzbekistan. Other cases were he wanted, he talked about a zero tolerance of corruption and yet wanted to expand assistance to some of the most corrupt countries in the world because they were allies of the United States. So it was really undermining the multilateral system and not focusing on what the World Bank is supposed to be focusing on, which is reducing poverty in the poorest countries of the world. Well, the problems of the fact, you would have thought that an institution that keeps talking about about good governance would itself have good governance. But it doesn't, when choosing the head, doesn't look for the most qualified person in the world. It's whoever the President of the United States wants. And in the case of the IMF, it's whoever the EU wants. I think, and one can show this, I think, very forcefully, that governance problems have contributed to these bad outcomes. I think also one has to recognize that the failures of global governance reflect weaknesses in our own democracies within the advanced industrial countries, the fact that so often special interests have dominated national interest. We talk about the cotton subsidies. It's not in America's interest to have these cotton subsidies, which do so much harm. They go to only 25,000 farmers. We have to ask, how can 25,000 farmers do so much harm to so many? 10 million people in sub-Saharan Africa have their income decreased to benefit 25,000 rich American farmers. And most of the money goes to 10,000 of these. Well, it's an example of the fact of the role of special interest. Moreover, globalization as it's been managed has actually undermined democracy because of the excessive conditionalities and the way these conditionalities have reduced the scope for democratic decision-making within these countries. In many of these countries, they're told it's so important to have democracy, and then the next thing they say, but by the way, on the things that are really important, you can't have any voice. The international community has dictated you have to do this and this and this. Well, to summarize, globalization has made us more interdependent. Greater interdependence means greater need for collective action to act cooperatively, but just as the world has greater need for global economic institutions, confidence in these institutions has waned. The fundamental problem can be put simply that economic globalization has outpaced political globalization. Too often, views about democracy, social justice, social solidarity, even the rule of law change at the border. I saw that so clearly when I was in the Clinton administration, when we talked about issues of domestic economic policy, we would always talk about what was efficient, but we would also talk about what was fair. When it came to international economic policy, the word fairness never entered into the vocabulary. When we sent our trade minister, the US trade representative, to Geneva to negotiate a trade agreement, we didn't say, come back with a fair trade agreement. If he did that, he would be fired. We say, come back with the best agreement for America, and what we meant by that was not the best agreement for America, we meant the best agreement for our major campaign contributors. And that's what they did. So in intellectual property, another example, the Clinton administration was committed to getting more access to healthcare, more access to medicine. That was one of the big issues in the '92 campaign. But when it went to Geneva into trade negotiations, it focused on getting less access by making generic medicines unavailable to the poor countries. So it was doing exactly the opposite. Why? Because the pharmaceutical companies were contributing. And domestically, American citizens said, we want access to medicines. Internationally, the people who don't have access don't vote. But the pharmaceutical companies make campaign contributions. Democracies have learned how to temper the market economy and make sure that most individuals benefit, but we have not yet learned how to temper the excesses of globalization. And while globalization has put new demands on the nation state, for instance, associated with growing inequality, it has reduced their ability to respond. And part of the reason that globalization is not working is that we have not yet really democratized globalization. In some ways, matters have become worse in recent years because of the end of the Cold War. In the Cold War, we had to pay attention to the developing countries because we had to win their allegiance in the Cold War. When we gave assistance to Mobutu in the Congo, we knew that the money was going in a Swiss bank account. But we were trying not to promote development, we were trying to get their allegiance in the Cold War. And it worked for that purposes, but it didn't work for development. At the end of the Cold War, we had a choice. We had a choice either to change international economic policy based on principles of democracy and helping the poor, or we had the opportunity to use power to make sure that the multinational corporations in the vast industrial countries could get what they wanted. Because we didn't have to contend with the fighting of winning the allegiance of again in the Cold War. Well, unfortunately, we made the wrong choice. We let it be determined not on the basis of principles, but on the basis of special interest. We missed the opportunity for global leadership, and we used our position to advance parochial commercial interest, often in a unilateralist manner. But in the last 6 years, things have become even worse. I want to emphasize, though, that the opposition to globalization is not to the globalization itself, but to the way it has been managed, to both the way it's been managed to advance the advanced industrial countries' special interest, the fact that economic values have dominated other values and undemocratic processes, and to the particular set of ideologies that have underlaid these policies, the market fundamentalism, and what's referred to as the market, to the Washington Consensus policies. Well, as I said, it's not globalization itself, it's the way it's been managed. And the reason I emphasize this is because I want to emphasize that change is possible. In fact, I would argue that change is inevitable. The world is changing, there's new global geopolitics. Today, China is giving more aid for infrastructure than the World Bank and the African Development Bank combined. It's part of the new geopolitics. There are new technologies, the new economy, new scarcities associated with oil, climate change, and globalization has set in motion its own changes. For instance, while the negotiators have been negotiating about cotton subsidies, the WTO panel has ruled those cotton subsidies are illegal. So the U.S. is trying to continue something that WTO has already declared to be illegal. And the U.S. Congress right now is in the process of passing a bill continuing these illegal subsidies. So the question is only whether we make the changes before a crisis occurs in a way which is likely to be a patchwork, setting in motion another crisis at a later date, or whether we work together to make globalization work, or at least to make it work better. And one of the main points in my book, Making Globalization Work, was to lay out an agenda of the kinds of reforms that would make it work better. And I'll go through these just very quickly. In trade, having a true development round. And the point of this is that there's a much richer agenda than just agriculture. There's been too much focus on agriculture. There's lots of other things that would make a big difference. And as I put it here in the slide, if the developed world is willing to commit 0.7% of GDP to help poor countries, shouldn't they help them also by opening up their markets to give them an opportunity to earn income for themselves? And I've argued that there should be a generalized market access, expanding and extending the initiative that Europe has of opening up markets to the poorest countries of the world. And here I just list a large number of items of what a true development agenda would look like. In the area of finance, there needs to be more extended debt relief, but more reforms are needed, because unless we think about the reason so many countries have debt burdens beyond their ability to pay, it's going to happen again. And part of the reason for it has to do with the fact that we force developing countries to bear the risk of interest rate and exchange rate volatility. So we have to figure out better ways of shifting the burden of risk from those less able to those more able to bear that burden to the developed countries. And I describe how that can be done. The most important reform in the global financial system is the reform of the international reserve system. Right now, the developing countries hold literally trillions of dollars in reserves. And what does that mean? That means they're lending money to the United States at very low interest rates. At one point, they were lending the United States money at 1% interest and borrowing money from the United States at 20% interest. It's a bad deal. Now at least they're getting 5%. But what we calculate is the total amount of foreign aid from the poor countries to the United States is larger than American foreign aid to the developing world. That is to say, the amount of implicit foreign aid from low-cost loans from the developing world as they hold this money in reserves is, you can think of that as a foreign aid package, and it's huge. There's a beginning of a move in the right direction in the Shanghai Initiative, but I describe in my book how that can be extended and how it actually can create a more stable global financial system. We need to have global legal reform, for instance, to make sure that those who destroy the environment are held accountable, that those areas where there's a lack of competition internationally, something is done about it. Global monopolies are dangerous, and it's impossible in a globalized world to attack global monopolies piece by piece by piece. And we need an international competition authority. One of the problems in Africa is that these countries face what is called the resource curse, the fact that on average, countries with rich endowments of resources grow more slowly than countries without resources. And a lot of research has gone into what is the reason for it and what can be done to escape it. But one of the important aspects of this that I talked about here, or three important I talk about here, one is greater transparency, expanding the extractive industries initiative so that people know what the governments are getting. But one way to enforce it overnight is to make only transparent payments tax deductible. A few years ago, bribes were tax deductible. In other words, governments in many of the advanced industrial countries were paying 50% of the cost of the bribe. They were subsidizing corruption. I was the representative of America in the ministerial meeting at the OECD where I tried to push this anti-bribery agenda, and there was a lot of resistance because it was a way of doing business. Well, lack of transparency is a way of doing business, but I think it's one that's very bad for the developing countries. The OECD had an initiative to reduce bank secrecy. Bank secrecy is important because the corrupt money goes out of the country. A lot of money is flowing out of Africa into these secret bank accounts where they're protected. The OECD had an agreement to reduce bank secrecy. And in August of 2001, the Bush administration vetoed that initiative. In September of 2001, we all know what happened, and they discovered these secret bank accounts were being used to finance the terrorists. Since then, we've, on the one hand, shown that you can shut down bank accounts, secret bank accounts, and we've done it in the case of terrorism. But in the other areas, in the area of corruption, when the Bush administration came out, when they vetoed that bill in August of 2001, champagne corks were popping all over the corrupt world. They were celebrating, and they have continued to celebrate. There's actually a book coming out in about 6 months detailing the expansion of secret bank accounts since the Bush administration vetoed, how it opened up a global crime, a vehicle for corruption around the world. We also need to develop model contracts that ensure the developing countries get their fair share of the resources. Global warming, I detail here a whole broad agenda beyond Kyoto of what to do. One of them I just want to mention here is because it's begun to get resonance, and that is it makes so much more sense to tax bad things than good things, to tax pollution rather than working savings. And this is an idea that I've been pushing, and I'm pleased to say that about 2 weeks ago, both Gordon Brown and Sarkozy in France endorsed this basic principle. Finally, we need more foreign assistance. We need more of it and more effective. The advanced industrial countries have committed to give 0.7% of GDP. It's actually a commitment that they made a long time ago. They renewed that commitment at Monterey. But except for a few of the Scandinavian countries, most of the countries are nowhere near to living up to that commitment. Global poverty is one of the most important problems facing the world today. Assistance has played an important role in the past in reducing global poverty and can play an even bigger role in the future, especially when the programs are based on the successes of the past, successes such as those that have marked East Asia. We now know much more about how to make aid effective. Japan, as the second largest economy in the world, has an especial responsibility for making globalization work, including working for developing countries. And I would also argue an especial opportunity, because Japan understands development, because it went through the development process itself so recently. It understands the need for global peaceful cooperation. Poverty, the whole world has learned that military power doesn't get you very much. It's soft power that works. It's a civilian society that's important. Poverty in the developing countries is one of the major global problems facing the world. Japan has long been committed to promoting growth and fighting poverty in the developing world. The new organization, in which Madam Ogata mentioned that JICA will be evolving into, puts it in a position to do so even more effectively in the coming years. Thank you very much.